Now that everyone can hear me again, welcome to the Perceptive Podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Bleiser, and we have another chat lined up today. My returning guest is a designer, programmer. He does Twitch as well, talking about game design, programming, and more. And we're going to be having a little chat, not only catching up, but also discussing some of the challenges of programming and coding in video games, as well as any kind of useful tips for people getting started. So, please welcome back to the cast, Tim Beaudet. How are you doing?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yep, it's great to have you. It's been quite a while since our last chat. I've been incredibly busy, so time has lost all meaning for me. But how's everything for you?
It's been going. I think our last chat was back when I was working on Turbo Boom, which has been put on hold for a while. But I've actually released a couple games since, and am planning a sequel to one of them starting next year, like at the beginning of the next year.
Great. So, before we get started with the chat, and thank you to everyone watching, as well Draken and Ito, hopefully I didn't butcher that too badly. If you do have any questions about programming, coding when it comes to video games, I am certainly not the guy to answer them, but I'm pretty sure Tim is. So if you do have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. If you are watching this recorded in the future, be sure to leave your comments there as well. But I guess to get things started, for new people tuning in, since it has been a while since our last chat, could you give a little bit about your background and kind of what you've been doing in terms of game dev?
So, where to start on that one? I worked in the industry for a little more than 5 years, actually, as a gameplay programmer. Bounced around to a few different studios, and eventually got into software development more because of stability reasons. But when I was in the software development, it allowed me to have enough free time and energy to start working on my own games, which has been the dream job that I've always wanted. And so I've started streaming my game development process during that period. It was basically every morning before going to work. I would wake up at 6 in the morning and stream until 9 a.m., which then would go to work. But for the last year, I've actually been making my own games full-time, streaming the process live every day. And as of right now, I have Accelerate out on Steam, and we're going to be making a sequel to that starting at the beginning of the year. So around January, I'm going to start the sequel and hopefully get that released by probably Easter.
All right. And in terms of your Twitch channel, for people watching, what do you do or cover on Twitch?
I cover all the aspects that go into an indie adventure, from the business planning to the marketing, the game design, the programming. I even cover some art when I'm capable of doing it. Basically, everything that goes into my business is covered there on Twitch.
Mm-hmm. And I remember from, I think what it could either been our last chat or the one before that, that you have also actually created your own game engine that you worked on. Is that right?
I have, yes. Most of my games have been made with my own game engine, but the Accelerate was actually made with Unity, and I'm going to be returning to Unity to make the sequel just because I have a lot of stuff there that already has the problem solved. There's no sense in putting in the effort again.
Mm-hmm. All right, and hello, Pony. Thanks for stopping by. So, as I said a few minutes ago, when it comes to the programming coding side of game dev, this is certainly not an area that I am versed in. So I'm glad that you're here to answer these questions and definitely feel them from the audience. So I guess to start things off, for students or enthusiasts watching, what is kind of like when we talk about coding when it comes to video games? how does it differ from when we talk about traditional programming, or when we talk about, like, when I was growing up and trying to learn programming myself? I took various classes both in high school and college, and they were dealing with more, like, I guess, like workplace coding, database entries, like things that when we think about video games, it's not necessarily, I think, when people think about coding for video games that comes to mind.
Um, I think it depends on how you're approaching it. They're just different problems, but you're still using the same code to solve those
Hmm.
problems, really. Obviously, video games has a more interesting problem set, at least to me. When you're working on, say, the bank software or whatever other business application you might have, it's kind of like you're just moving things around, or it it doesn't have the fun element, right? It's kind of boring and bland. But when you're making a game, it's like you're trying to move the player, and that's basically the same thing as moving other things in the business software, except you actually get to see it happen on screen in front of you and even interact with it in real time, which is um, it's just all about using the different keywords that the languages provide you to build up those experiences, at least to me.
Hmm. And when it comes to the language side, this is something that when I talk to, or when I do my library presentations, kind of talking to students and people who have never looked at video games before, in terms of how language has developed, or the programming languages, what is kind of considered, like, has, like, the standards or what's considered popular changed over the past decade?
Um, I I've been outside of the actual game industry for a while, so I'm not entirely sure if C++ is still kind of at the top there. But when I was inside the industry, that was still basically where a lot of the games were being developed with, generally with custom engines for each studio. Although there was starting to become a shift of using Unreal, and Unity was just barely kind of getting into the industry at that point.
Hmm.
That may have shifted quite a bit since I've actually been in the professional industry. But I know even at that period of time when I was in the industry, it was for a indie developer. Unity was already there and was already getting pretty popular, um, as far as being able to pick it up, as well as Game Maker and a couple other things that it just, with my opinion, it doesn't necessarily matter too much what tool you're using. They're all tools. They're all going to
Hmm.
have some strengths. They're all going to have some weaknesses. But if you're just getting started and you've not touched any code at all, I would say something like Unity is probably a good place to start because there's just so many tutorials out there that will kind of help you along the way. Game Maker has the drag and drop coding, so you don't even have to type
Yeah.
anything. You just change values within some like little blocks. You can drag the blocks in and change values and make variables that way, which makes it quite user friendly when you don't know if you want to do coding, because it is kind of a different level of thinking. Um, but it
Hmm.
really doesn't matter what engine you choose. Just stick with it for a while, kind of learn the ins and outs. You'll find what you don't like, you'll find what you do like. And after you've been in one for a while, then you can go explore another one just to get differences and see if you like another one better. But just hopping around because somebody says that X is better than Y and then Z is better than Y, and you're just going to chase yourself in circles.
Hmm. And one thing that I've been hearing from a lot of developers, or at least over the last few months or so, or actually a few weeks, has been Godot or Godot. Has there been, like, what are your thoughts on that engine? Because I've been hearing a lot of that, like, growing in popularity, especially with all the news surrounding the Unity this year.
Um, I've only used Godot for one really little project. I think it was like 3 or 4 hours. And it's just my little highway racer that I tend to use for my test bed whenever I'm making a project in a new engine. It's a game that doesn't actually take any design. It's very simple to make. It has enough interaction stuff to test out your input, your sounds, and a bunch of other various things that you need in an engine. Godot has definitely been gaining in popularity through the last couple of years anyway, maybe even 3 years. It's been growing. When I was testing it, it felt like there's still a lot of loose ends um, to improve.
Mm-hmm.
Like it worked. I didn't find many bugs, but it was also like clunky to find out how I needed to do something. It wasn't just a straightforward process of doing everything. That's probably something that's still being worked on, and it's been at least a year since I tried it, so it's possible that some of this has been addressed.
All right. And to Pony's comment in chat about like working with like mods and editing programs like that for popular games, that's been something that I find very interesting because in like the 90s into the early 2000s, that was like one of the main entry points. I know for a lot of developers, I'm sure there are a lot of indie devs watching this who have probably got started working on a mod to one of their favorite games. But it's something that I really haven't heard, at least in like blowing up as much over the past decade. And I just want to ask you, like, have you heard or seen anything in terms of using mods and SDKs like that as a viable entry point, at least in today's market for prospective game devs?
It's definitely a way that you can practice. I would say more the game design or even art side.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's definitely mods out there that have some coding as well, but I think it's a good place for you to get a foot in, showing that you can design a level for a game, for instance, and practice those skills so that you can prove to a company like, yeah, I got what it takes to make good levels. All these players are
Mm-hmm.
enjoying the mods I've made in these several different games, and probably want to do that across more than just one game, so that you have more to show than just that one thing. But um, I do think that is a viable way to get started, especially when you back it up with other experiences that you could probably make on your own with probably Unity or another engine. Even working in teams for like game jams is another thing you can do to start getting um, your name out there as far as getting positions or such.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking about like getting started, one of the things that I hear from a lot of teens when they after like my library talks and they ask me these questions is about using stuff like Roblox and Minecraft, which, as I get to be the old man again and say like I've never touched a Roblox before, but games like this, like these kinds of very vast sandbox programs, do you see them, or like what are your thoughts on having them as a gateway to game dev, or as kind of like dipping your toe into programming for kids?
Um, I haven't played with either of them enough to know myself entirely, but I do know my niece is actually playing a bit with Roblox and wants to figure out some game development stuff. So I'd say that does seem to be a pretty good gateway. I don't know what anything looks like as far as tackling that goes, but it seems like there's some interest there, and that does seem capable.
All right. And to Pony's question, I was thinking the similar thing. I may have asked this one to you when you were first on, but I certainly don't remember the answer. Is there a difference between saying coding and programming? And if so, what is the difference?
Um, I don't think there's too much of a difference, at least the way I use it, and most people tend to use it. I think they're basically the same thing. I think if you go back far enough, there's a difference of um, coding is more of a taking the instruction sets or different types of kind of like systematic coding, like you'd encode the books, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a library, they would be a certain book would get encoded over here and separate by their different types. I think that's possibly where the distinction became, but it's basically used as the same thing these days.
All right. Returning to what you were saying a few minutes ago about the differences between, like, when we talk about, I guess, like working a job as a programmer and doing video games or programming a game, and how they're about solving different challenges or different problems. For like students or first timers watching this, what do you feel is, like, I guess, like the biggest challenge from a programming perspective when it comes to video games specifically? Maybe something that, if someone takes like a traditional programming class or something that is not game dev related, that they run into when it's time to start working on a game.
I'd say probably the biggest challenge would be getting graphics going if you're not using an engine that's basically supplying some stuff for you. And most of those courses that are aimed more at business stuff aren't going to teach you a language that is either showing you graphics right there or giving you the tools such as Game Maker or Unity or something that has a game engine giving you the graphics. So I think that would be your first biggest hurdle. And for the most part, that is just take the bits that you've learned, look on Google for either an engine with that language, because that's probably going to exist, or try taking what you're learning and then also apply it to another language, which might be a lot for somebody just starting out, but also is once you know the tools of programming, and these tools are things like if statements and how to deal with the logic, making variables, dealing with loops, for loops and while loops and such. Once you get these core little tools and structures in place, jumping to different languages actually isn't terribly hard, because that's what programming is about, is just solving problems using those sets of commands. And most of the languages share some expected commands that are just kind of everywhere.
Okay. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, something that, like, again, as someone who's kind of from the outside when it comes to programming, especially this past year, I've had a chance to play lots and lots and lots of indie games. Thanks to festivals, has given me a chance to. Again, I think I've gone over 100 games I've played and covered this year, and that is still like barely a drop. And one of the challenges I think I see from a lot of indie developers is kind of setting up. I'm not sure how to phrase this. Maybe like the nuts and bolts of their UI and their menus, or like the options in the game. And when I talk about this, I'm talking about like stuff that I think for a lot of mainstream consumers we kind of take for granted. Things like making sure that there is a VSync option, making sure that your menu or your game set up to allow you to turn on and off vibration on a controller. My all-time favorite phrase, volume sliders, when it comes to video games. And if Josh, the other Josh, who I do my Saturday show with, is watching, we were talking again about kind of making sure that your option menu and your your landing page, essentially, for your game is working and functional. And I wanted to ask you, like, specifically from a programming and a coding perspective, what is like the difficulty, or is there a challenge to getting like these, almost again, like these basic building blocks to your game's UI and UX working and functional for your game?
I think there's a couple things happening there. First of all, user interface stuff and even user experience, both of those kind of cross a little bit there, are some of the hardest things to actually code for. First of all, users don't necessarily use things the way you want them or designed them. They just shove the square into a circle, even though it wasn't supposed to fit. So you got to kind of deal with so many edge cases there that it can be challenging. But I think another part of it can be that that's not the glorious part of game development or even really playing the game in some sense. I mean, obviously if there's something about the game that's bothering you and having that option would have reduced the bother or even eliminated it entirely, that would be a huge win. But it's kind of it doesn't get like super thought of until either the very end or it if you're sharing what you're working on Twitter or whatever social medias you're on these days, it's kind of like, who wants to see me work on a menu button when I could be adding some sword attack to my player? You know, like there's so many more interesting things. And then also, does a button actually add more value to the game than adding that sword attack with the player? You know, like there's something you're going to do over and over and over again versus just this one time you could I mean, obviously you can change the volume with a slider. That's nice and neat. You can also usually just turn your computer up and down too. So I do believe that the game should support this stuff and have a good user experience, but there's also other ways around some of these problems that people have become blind to almost while they're developing the game because there's more juicy things to play with.
Yeah, and I think that is a really solid and very important point for any students and even first-time developers watching this. Because it is that challenge. Again, as everyone here knows, there's only 24 hours in a day. And do you spend your day making sure that your attack animations work and that, your blocking and parrying is on point? Or do you spend that time making sure the mute button, works or is aesthetically linked to everything else in your game? And it is a very tough line for a lot of developers to walk. But I think from my perspective, as someone who covers games and deals with consumers, that it's something that no matter how much of a pain it may sound like or how much it takes away, it's something you got to do. Because the consumer, and this is something that for new people watching this who may not have heard this yet, but something that we say a lot here is that the consumer doesn't care about the amount of time and work you put into the game. They care about making sure that if they click on the options button because let's say they have screen tearing and they want to turn VSync, if there's no VSync, they're going to probably quit your game. Or if there's no key rebindings, or like I say, volume sliders. Like it's, as you said, like to a lot of people, like to a lot of developers, like this stuff sounds like, who cares? I don't, I can just turn my volume on my computer down. Like, why should I even spend an iota of my time working on this? But it's often, I think, where we see that distinction between the enthusiast side of game dev and the business or product side of game dev. And those two things oftentimes can be very different.
Yeah, I think that's where making games just for fun and for yourself or for close friends and such come in different from, as you said, doing it as a business and trying to make a good product that does scratch those itches and make sure that you support the players that have screen tearing or might want to listen to your sound effects because those usually have pretty important gameplay cues, but maybe don't want the music on. Maybe they want to listen to their own music or something else. Like just having the option to turn the music off or deal with the screen resolutions, or like there's so many different things that you should have some basic level of care for the end user's experience.
All right. And before I get to Pony's question or Pony's questions, one thing that I want to ask you is this is something that also came up when I was talking to students. So this was about like a month ago. We were having this whole chat, or they weren't even like programs; they were just like teenagers like getting interested in game design. And one question that someone asked was, how much of a difference is it working in 2D than it is in 3D when it comes to programming? But one of them was like, oh, it just sounds like it'd be very easy. Like, why shouldn't I just start with my 3D game? And for every programmer watching this right now, I'm pretty sure I just added like 5 years to their life. They just aged a few decades with that one.
Um, I mean, the state of things with, say, Unity and all kinds of other game engines. I come back to Unity just because that's the one that I've touched most recently, and it comes into my head. It's also seemingly the most popular. But it's not that big of a difference when you have all of that supporting you already. Back in my day, to age myself a little, it was like didn't have any of that stuff, and to try doing 3D was absolutely mind-boggling. Like I didn't have something to do that math and anything. I had to do it by hand, and ultimately it just became copying it from some forums that I was on at that point in time, and that's what got me started. So today it is a lot easier. Like the step is kind of just adding that other dimension. But when you do add that other dimension, there is some more gotchas in certain ways. Like typically Unity will handle this for you, especially with Googling this is my problem in 3D, and you're probably going to find something that's going to help you out. But you think, okay, so you're just adding one more value, right? Like one more value. You had X and Y, and now you add a Z. But it's not that simple because you used to be able to rotate around one axis, and that would be your Z axis. Usually, it comes out of the screen, and that's the direction your sprite rotates. You can't rotate in any other direction. And all of a sudden, you got 2 more degrees of rotation as well, and it makes it a lot more challenging to orient your objects the way you want, or do the physics and all the stuff. Like I said, mostly the game engines these days can take care of you, and it really is, if you want to get started in making 3D games, there's no real reason not to try diving straight into it. Also, practicing with some 2D games is not a bad place to start either.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I would say don't let it hold you back if you're trying to make a 3D game, and if you feel like it's overwhelming, don't feel bad about starting with 2D either. Like, both of those are good starting points.
Okay. And when it comes to the actual 3D camera itself, from a programming perspective, how does like that add or complicate matters in terms of programming your game?
Cameras are some of the most difficult things to program. Like, a good camera does so much that you don't necessarily see or feel, and that's how it's good. It's not too hard to make a camera follow an object, but to make it follow an object with, like, if you study older games, I'm going to go with some 2D games here just because it's easier to use a side scroller. If you study some of the older games, they won't start moving the camera until you get to a certain point on the screen. It doesn't just start moving immediately.
Yeah.
And then if you turn around and go back the other way, it waits until you get to probably the left third of the screen until it starts moving that way again. And this is what that type of coding is a lot more involved. You have to really kind of think out the edge cases, and it's what adds the feel, I think. Like, it's one thing just to have the camera follow the player, and that can work. but it's another level of polish for it to actually do it in a way that doesn't hurt the game. Like it's smoother, for lack of better words.
Oh yes, it's one of the things I talk about in my book on platform design that a lot of people I think take for granted what you just said about even just making sure that the camera doesn't start moving until maybe I'm like right here on the screen or maybe even like right here, being able to properly pan when you're going up or down. Like these are things that again, it sounds so simple when we like talk about like right here, but these are aspects again that if it doesn't feel right, it just sinks the entire game.
I will say that jumping into a 3D camera is by far harder than the 2D camera. Because the 2D camera, you only have the three things you can do. You can move left and right, up and down, and then you can zoom in and out. I mean, technically, you could probably rotate in some ways, but generally speaking, that gets you sick. At least if not done right. Whereas when you get to a 3D camera, that's where even using a game engine, you're probably going to have to deal with some of the higher up math to get the camera to smoothly work the way you want. It's not quite as simple as just adding that extra dimension.
Mm-hmm. As a somewhat unrelated tangent, when it comes to the 3D camera, the act of the camera kind of like going through a wall, and like when you get close to a wall, it kind of like looks through the wall itself, kind of thing. How does that like work from a programming perspective, or like any like insights on that kind of challenge?
I'm guessing you're talking about when the camera kind of clips and the wall
Yeah.
disappears on you. That is sort of just a natural behavior of how we do the rendering with a camera. So you have the near plane and a far plane. And the near plane is a cutoff point that any graphics on this side of the plane don't get shown. So if you had a wall that was right here and it intersects with that near plane, the stuff on the right side of that near plane was going to go away. It wouldn't display anymore. And that's where you get the big hole cut in. Though generally speaking, you want to avoid that because it doesn't always come across looking that great. And the way to do that effectively is to add a collision body to your camera that keeps it away from other solid objects to ensure that they aren't that close to the near plane that you see through them like that. That is kind of a whole involved thing, but that's skimming over the top of it.
Let me see. I know Pony asked a few questions. And again, for the new people who join late, if you do have any questions for Tim about programming, anything related to that aspect of game dev and game design, please get them in. We're going to be going for probably another 30 to 40 minutes, give or take. And we still have some time. But let me scroll back up for a second. One thing that Pony asks, and I think this kind of relates to what we were talking about on our previous conversation about custom engines. But again, we could spend like 2 or 3 hours just on this one topic. But they want to ask, what goes into creating a custom engine? Like, what's the process of actually building a custom engine for a game?
That is definitely involved.
Yeah.
It depends on what you want your engine to do and so many things, like what features you want to support and how you want to tackle it. Do you want to start with frameworks that kind of handle the rendering or physics or other parts, and you just want to kind of tie them together? Or do you want to write the physics and graphics and everything and tie them together yourself? I think I think most people refer to an engine as doing all of that themselves, but there is that middle ground that I just described. So if you are going to go ahead and tackle everything yourself, let's say your first goal, in my opinion, is to get just something displaying on the screen. It could be a simple triangle, it could be a quad. It doesn't matter what it is. Just something displaying on the screen. Get some form of audio happening and some form of input. Those are absolutely critical to making a game. Once you have colors moving on the screen and ways to play sound, and you can tie this to some form of player input, at that point, start making games. Don't necessarily worry so much about developing everything in your engine, which is what I fell into a trap for years. For so many years, I would go ahead and try making, this is going to be the engine, and I'll add all the features I'm ever going to need in here, and then I'll build the game. The thing is, either it collapses under its own weight because you've put too much stuff together and it just doesn't have organization, or you never get to your game, and once you try getting to your game, you come to the realization that it was just a big tech demo and it doesn't actually work for making a game. So if you tackle this as early as possible with making games, and as your game needs something, add that to the engine, and kind of limit yourself to, every game I make, I'll add 1 or 2 features to the engine and keep repeating that cycle. Obviously, for your first games, you're probably going to want something that's like a game jam size or even smaller. You want to take really, really small games. And as you grow, those games can get bigger. The features in the engine will get more complex. And that's how I've approached the development of my own custom engine, Turtle Brains. And it's actually why I think I'm still working with my engine, even though I started it in 2013, I think. Like, I've been working on it for a long time. And before 2013, I worked on maybe 10 or 15 different engines that didn't go anywhere because of the previous trap I mentioned. So definitely make sure you're working on a game and do the engine on the side of that, if that is something that's important to you.
All right. And then the other question Pony asked, a friend told him about putting dynamic prompt displays in a game and that it was easy and simple. And is that true or false?
What is a dynamic prompt display? Like having the text kind of expand the text box a little bit, or chop up the text into certain lines based on the size of the box? That's what I'm imagining would be dynamic text.
You can clarify it, Pony. Let me know. While we wait for that, I can go to his other question, and that was, are programmers, or are we hyped about... Oh wait, came in as I was saying that. It means the prompts you get, like gamepad buttons display change when you switch your controller. So I'm assuming he means that, like, okay, if you're using a keyboard, the UI will show, Q for this, S for that. If you're then switch a gamepad, then switch to maybe A for this, or square for that.
Yes. This can be easy. It can also be a giant ball of a mess that is not easy. It depends so much on how the game was developed to begin with. It depends on your familiarity with the engine, or even the framework the engine lets you play with. I actually did this for Accelerate, and I had an expectation that Unity was going to work pretty much right out of the box for me, and I was so disappointed that that was a lot harder to add than I was expecting. Like, significantly hard. I had to go through so many loopholes to make it so that the keyboard and gamepad could be switched at. Like, if I start playing with the keyboard, it starts working on the keyboard. If I start playing on the gamepad, it starts displaying the Xbox icons. So it really depends on a lot of situations, and I've heard the newer input system in Unity, they changed it basically just after or just during I was making Accelerate. I've heard the new input system helps with that. I haven't had any experience with that system and trying to switch between devices like this. But I do know in my own engine and my own workflow there, it wouldn't have been as terrible once I figure out which device the player is using. That would have been the challenge in my own engine. But but I ran into a few more challenges in Unity simply because that's not all my stuff, right? You're using somebody else's stuff and they've kind of designed things in certain ways, which tend to work for a lot of different edge cases, but not when you're trying to go against the grain, if you will.
All right. Let's see. Guido asked, let's see. Would you suggest a wannabe game dev to try writing a game engine, even a very basic one, just to learn some basics, or not?
It depends on what you want to get out of doing your game development. Like, if you want the deeper technical knowledge, I would say, yeah, give it a shot. Go try it. If you're looking more just to understand how a game in particular works, say you're making a racing game and you just want to move the car around, then making game engine isn't necessarily going to help you with any of that. It's just going to kind of slow you down towards making the car move, right? Like, it really just depends on where you're trying to go with what you want to learn.
Okay. And I guess like for like students, if there's any students who are really like people who are just who've never touched coding before to begin with, are there any? I guess here's a for like informational sense. Are there any useful sites or repositories out there in terms of like useful video tutorials or like collection for people who have never, let's say they have never touched coding in their lives and they want to start trying to do something? Are there any like first time places that you would recommend?
Off the top of my head,
Mm-hmm.
not exactly. I would say Google is a great first place. And I kind of have almost a knee-jerk reaction to somebody off like saying this is where you should start. There is no place you should start. You should start.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is my advice that I try coming across. Like, there's going to be plenty of people saying you should start in Unity, or you should start in GameMaker, or you should start in Godot, or you could change those for anything out there. You should start by programming. You should start by making art. The important part isn't where or how you start. It is that you start. You have an idea, presumably, that you want to make. And I would try making that idea as simple as you can. Pong, Breakout, these things are very, very hard to make your very first time. And it's always good practice, even if you've made them a few times, actually. But just have the idea you want to make and then try breaking that into smaller problems. And I know I come at this from like so many years of experience programming and making games. But if you take the example of Pong and you're like, I want to make Pong, that's your goal. You need to break it down into smaller problems. So first thing Pong needs is a ball, and the ball needs to move. Once you get the ball moving, then you probably need to bounce it off a wall. And then you need to bounce it off a paddle. And then those paddles need to move with input. And you need to break the problem down into those little tiny pieces and tackle that one piece each time you're going. I don't think it matters where, how, or how long it takes, or anything on those edges. The thing that matters is that you're trying. You're getting started.
Right. And even like with Pong itself, we've even seen developers like do like very unique and different things beyond that. Tony mentioned 3D Pong. I played Pong RPG. Again, like Pong is a really solid, I think, baseline. Try and mess with something to you've kind of gotten your feet wet.
Yeah, I've made a Pong where you're driving a car, and that's your paddle. You're a car driving around, and you have to hit the ball.
um, One question I want to ask you about that was coming to my mind is about the idea of programming for accessibility. And this probably in of itself could be like its own podcast because it is a very complicated challenge. But over the past decade, one of the things that we've seen, I think, a really big push from consumers and advocacy groups has been trying to build games around more accessibility features. Beyond just what we talked about earlier with volume sliders and control rebindings, we're talking about having subtitles, colorblind mode, even the idea, as you were saying earlier, we were talking about like dynamic prompts, about the game recognizing different inputs, having games that can recognize a controller specifically for someone who can't use their hands, or even more options. And I want to get your thoughts from the programming side, because one of the things that we hear from a lot of consumers and people who are against this is that, oh, it's too hard, oh, it takes up too much time, and that kind of thing. But from a programming standpoint, what is there a challenge, or are there any unique considerations about building your game around accessibility features?
There are definitely challenges depending on what specifically you are um, trying to support. Like, there is actually already a challenge to support key binding, for instance, and that could just be on someone's own controller. That doesn't even need to be a special controller at that point, right? Like, just supporting different keybinds for different actions can be a challenge on its own. Um, and then if you want to then try saying, okay, maybe we have to use the mouse for something that we weren't using the mouse for because somebody's able to move a mouse but not play with the keyboard right. You get almost into sometimes a design point. It can go as far as pushing back into design. It's not always just the programming here, because can your game design even handle the input type? Like, maybe it's the accelerometer in a phone is the input type, and instead of using the keyboard for turning left and right, you're using the accelerometer. I mean, there'd be a slew of problems there as far as you then have to get the phone connected to your PC if it was a PC game. But it's it comes a bit into design, it comes a bit into the programming, and there will be at least some challenges depending on how accessible you want the support to be. It could be fairly easy, or it could be fairly challenging. Like, sometimes there's, I believe, some shader support that you can give it regular art that is not accessible to colorblind, but then the shaders itself will transform those colors so that it is more accessible. Of course, I feel like the best knowledge there, or the best advice that people have shared, is instead of relying on color alone, to actually change shapes as well. So it's not just here's the red and green circles, but here is a green circle and a red square. And then even if you're colorblind with red green, you can see those as different things.
Mm-hmm. And I could rant about symbology when it comes to video games and UI design for the next hour, so I will resist that one. And hey, Thorn, thanks for stopping by as well. Let's see, a few more questions, and as a time check, we're going for about 50 minutes, so we'll kind of go through this next set of questions. I do have one I want to ask you as well, and then we'll kind of take stock and see where we're at in terms of time. Let's see. So, from earlier, Pony asked regarding Unreal Engine 5, is that something that programmers are really keeping an eye on? And if so, are there any like things that really to focus on or to be excited about?
I believe UE5 has the nanite parts, and that seems pretty exciting, at least from the art and workflow side. I haven't paid so much attention because I don't use Unreal Engine. Like I typically build my own, but there is probably there probably will be a day where I jump into Unreal Engine just to fiddle around, see what I can learn from it, and just have the experience of doing so. Um, but that's gonna be my problem here is I don't pay that close attention to what all the engines are doing, and the technology's always moving. So if you're somebody that really does like to stay on that bleeding edge and know what's happening, you're probably likely to follow along with whatever tools you're using um, and understand that and even be interested in the tech. Like I think it's interesting the things I've heard of nanite, but I can't really formulate exact thoughts on it or how the tech does it because I haven't dug that deeply into it. It's just I've kind of heard that it's you throw in whatever models you want and it just kind of works as you wish. It performs magic.
There you go, magic and programming.
Programming is sometimes magical. You won't convince me otherwise.
Let's see. Pony asks, are UI designers really sought after and rare in the programming scene compared to other roles?
I don't know if they're rare or sought after necessarily, but like I don't know if there's specifically a I am a UI programmer role. I'm guessing there must be in some places because there is definitely a need for that programmer, but I feel like it'd be more like a task the gameplay programmer would get assigned. Like I'm a gameplay programmer and the user interface is part of that part of the gameplay really. um I do think it's fairly rare to find someone that enjoys UI programming to the point that they're going to put that on their as their title. Like, hey, I am a UI programmer. What do you need done? Um, it's as I was mentioning earlier, is such a challenging area that you're tying user experience and interface with the game, and you're trying to do it in a way that is nice and polished, and it looks pretty, and it's interactive, but also like animated. And there's a very fine balance there that if you're playing an animation too long, it just annoys everybody as they have to wait for that animation to finish before they're allowed to take another action. And there's lots of minute details in there.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Asked this, and this is actually something I was thinking about as well. I think this may actually could be its own topic. Do you think chasing performance in game programming may come at the cost of code readability, or achieving both is almost always possible?
That's a great question. I think chasing performance in game programming should be not avoided. I do not want to use those words, even though those were the ones that were trying to come out. You should generally strive to make the optimized choices that keep your code readable. Strive for readability over higher performing code until you find out that there's a hotspot there that needs the optimization. Like if you're trying to create thousands of enemies and something in the enemy update code is causing significant delays, at that point you need to find solutions to that problem. And sometimes the solution might be just reduce the enemy count, and sometimes it's let's get a little bit more clever about how they perform the update. Maybe this set of enemies, maybe like 200 of them update to every frame, and then the next 200 update the next frame instead of updating all 1,000 every frame. That's every one of these little optimizations that you can put in is going to add other layers of confusion or just more layers of stuff happening. And there are also points that you get to where it becomes a lot harder to read, as you're kind of mentioning. I don't have examples of that off the top of my head because I try to avoid this practice. Because seriously, always go for readable code. Like, these computers that we have today can do so much work. I don't want to say be lazy. Like, don't be lazy. Make sure you're actually trying to use the right containers and the big level optimization stuff. Don't cycle through an entire list of things when you could just random access an array, or be smart with those choices, but at the same time, keep the code readable. Optimize for the human brain, because you're going to be reading it again and again.
I guess this would be maybe an unrelated question regarding performance. One thing that I see from a lot of indie developers is that when it comes to FPS or frame rate in their games, that they will always leave things uncapped, no matter what the game or the genre may be. And I always can tell because I can hear my tower there starting to sound like a jet engine, within even loading up it's a simple 8-bit game, but it needs to have 300 FPS going. And I just wanted to ask, is this a common practice that any developers will do, or is this just another one of those little things that you can mess up on when you're building your first game?
I think that goes both ways. I think there's, as Pony just said, I think a lot of people don't like FPS locks. They like the ability to have it go as fast as their machine allows, and from a game, from the developer standpoint, maybe they didn't put the VSync lock in there, as we were kind of talking about earlier with the settings. But there's also a lot of talk and hype around how fast can you make your game run. That's thrown around a lot. You can't even do 70 frames a second. Why can't you do that? So when you get that thrown around, it's people probably just start going down that path, well, how fast does it run, and then just never really think about it again, because it's kind of like the menu part where you get developing it. Okay, so it's running fast enough, that's great, but you don't ever go back to say, we don't actually need to run this fast.
All right, let me see. As a time check, we are just at the hour now, so I'm going to put an official last call for any questions here. We have, I think, at least 2 more at the moment. I have 1 left for you as well. So if anyone has any final questions for Tim about programming and so on, please get them in now. So to go back up, let me see, where did that question? Okay, so the question from Thorn, he wanted to ask, any tips on how to deal with small dev making 3D art, making your own basic stuff versus any tools that make it easy? So he's saying not Blender level, but not high level car generator, so on.
Not Blender level. I don't know if I have any tips here. I'm gonna go with Blender, despite that being a no. I'm also gonna approach this from my own experiences as a programmer learning to do art. And maybe you're a programmer, maybe you're not, but look at something that you've practiced a lot. I've practiced programming for many, many, many years. I am good at programming. And when I go to do my art for my games, it's like I have a vision, I have what I want to make, but my abilities aren't necessarily to that level yet where I can just jump in and make what I wanted and it comes out the same way I want it every time. Sometimes it does. Sometimes I actually do get what I want, but there's a lot of times where I don't. And the reason just comes down to practice. You got to put in the time to practice. It takes a lot of effort to get there, but that's all it is. Think of other things you're good at, and you've probably spent a lot of time practicing it. Whether it's Blender or um, I think it's SketchUp. I might be wrong on that particular name, but there's a couple things out there that do kind of give you some more blocks to build with that are different than Blender. And yeah, just got to practice. Put in the time. Grind it out.
Oh, yes. Let's see. And this was a question from Pony that I'm fairly sure I asked this of you on our first chat, but even I don't remember the answer to that one. What exactly is a memory leak? And why it can't happen in AAA games? And so, like, where do you expect it wouldn't?
Was that why it can happen in AAA games?
I think so.
Okay. It can also happen in indie games.
Yes, it can.
In fact, game size has no depiction on whether there's a memory leak or not. You can write something with very few lines of code and wind up with a memory leak if you're either not careful or just being lazy and not cleaning up. So a memory leak is basically a resource that you're gathering. It could be opening up a file on your computer. It could be just allocating some memory for an object, like making a new player every frame instead of using the one that you already have. This is a bad example since players there's only so many of them. But like every time you create a bullet sprite in the world, if you create a new one every time and you never throw them away, that would be a memory leak. So that the longer the game plays, the more bullets spawn, and eventually it just starts either lagging out or it uses up all the memory and the system crashes. There are some languages that can help with this a little bit. I want to put the emphasis on a little bit there. So C# and other languages can be memory managed. And for the most part, that will clean up the bullets when the bullets are no longer used or held on by other containers or such. However, it is still possible to create a memory leak in these managed languages. It doesn't just make the problem go completely away, because if you're still creating bullets and holding them into a container, but then never removing them from that container when they're off screen or outside of the play area, then you've still leaked the memory. It's not like it solved your problem for you. I hope that answers the question in a way that is understandable.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I take for granted all the knowledge I have, and I just know it like the back of my hand at this point.
Mm-hmm. And as a somewhat my own question about this, will this also be the reason why for a lot of games, especially in 3D, that they will unload areas that the player is like not visiting, or they leave and then they have to reload it back and they go back that way?
Yeah, definitely. That would be for like basically a streamed level where you're loading it in chunks, and the chunks you haven't been at semi recently will get out of memory and then have to get loaded back up when you get back there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Let's see. Did we get any other questions? I think that was it. Thorn, did Tim answer your question about working with the assets, or was there anything else you wanted him to answer about that? And okay, yes, he did. So, with that said, I have one last question for you, and then this will be where we'll wrap things up after this. one of the, like, again, like with what I do with the game design books and like talking about every genre as its own like unique beast. The fact that you can't go from designing a racing game to then say, oh, I can now make a platformer or a survival horror game. From a programming perspective, I just want to get your thoughts on if someone, let's say, as an indie developer, and they start working in different genres. I'm gonna make a racer. I'm gonna make a platformer. I'm gonna make a deck builder. How does that change your thinking or your programming perspective, or does it, in terms of building a game in different genres, or building different genres as a developer?
It it's a very good question. I have a really good answer, but I'm trying to work it in there. Um, so every time you switch a genre like that, it is going to be a whole new set of problems. And as you improve the craft of programming, some of these problems will be easier to solve just kind of naturally as you practice. But this is actually one of the reasons why I stick with racing games. By sticking with racing games, and that's like my passion genre, so that's why I'm choosing that one to stay with. I I am limiting myself to what I can make. It's always going to be a racing game. You're always going to be trying to beat the clock or beat other players or race in some way or another. But by doing that, I can really master the skill of building a racing game. Whereas if I did jump to let's make a real-time strategy game, now I have to learn how to select units in a different way than you don't select units like that in a racing game. Like
Mhm.
you have to command them around. You have to have um, this whole system with a tech tree. Like there's all
Mhm.
of these components that get added that you have to solve programmatically, also design wise and everything else if that's not covered by other parts of your team. Um, and that's really good practice. In fact, for a lot of my career, I was bouncing around between whatever games I wanted to. It wasn't until I think about 4, maybe 5 years ago that I said I'm going to stick with racing games and really get amazingly good at that. Because as an indie developer, I need to try finding, I guess, corners to cut or corners to shave off to make games as fast as possible. Um, every time I take a 6 months to build a game, that 6 months has a real cost associated with it that if I take another 6 months building a whole different game, it's probably going to take longer than that 6 months because I have to redo absolutely everything. I have to relearn a whole genre. What do the players expect in that genre? And anytime you can speed up your development process as an indie developer is going to give you a little bit better chance to possibly find some success. At least that's the way I'm looking at this.
Mhm. Yep, and like that definitely leads into more like game dev and kind of game production talk that uh we could spend the next 3-4 hours on that one easily. And
Definitely.
to your examples about kind of the challenge of switching designs and practices, I can think of one big nightmare. Someone going to make a stealth game for the first time and having to learn how detection radiuses and, do you detect someone by sound and how does lighting impact things?
Yep.
And again, I'm just causing programmers to like age, a few decades throughout this entire conversation. uh, but yeah, that is a really good point again about that challenge, and again, like from a design perspective, why it's not as easy as I think people would think. In terms of, hey, I built a really good platformer. Surely that means I can now make a third-person shooter, or I can make a Dark Souls like, or I'm sure everyone here wants to make their first game, an open world No Man's Sky. Because I mean, that stuff is easy. I still love one of the teams was saying, but Josh, it just sounds like game dev is so easy. Like, why can't people just finish their game in like a year? Like, it just seems like you just work on it, in, a year or two, it just gets done. And again, every developer watching this just died a little bit more inside as I'm talking.
Yeah, if only it were that easy, really. Like your idea shifts. Game I find making a game is kind of close to um caring for a tree as it grows. It's going to change what it needs over time, and it changes its own direction over time. Like it doesn't just grow in the way that you planned it to grow. It shifts around. Accelerate is a great example of this. I went into Accelerate trying to make a nice, casual, anybody can pick the game up and play it from a game jam game that I had made that was carrying an egg on top of your car. I was like, everybody was going to want to play this. This is going to be good. I need to make it so that, your 8-year-old niece or nephew could pick it up and still play the game. As I'm developing the game, I'm probably like 2 months into a 3-month dev cycle, so I'm pretty far into it. It's becoming obviously clear to me that making it casual is almost impossible, to the point that the game is screaming, I need to be hard. And I had to lean into it because that's what the game was asking. There was no good way to make the game easy and still make it as exciting as it was. It was either easy and not exciting, which made it kind of boring, or it stayed difficult and was exciting. So you kind of just have to lean into what the game wants sometimes. And I think that's one of the critical things of finishing. Some people will get to that stage where the game is trying to tell them something different than what they want the game to do, and they will fight the game until they just give up. And sometimes you just need to realize it's not going to be exactly what you wanted and be kind of accepting of good is better than perfect that doesn't exist.
That's a really good sentiment right there, and again, one that we can rant and rave about for who knows how long. Pony did get one last minute question in, and this will be officially it. But is preloading things like textures or models so they load faster on subsequent occasions always a good idea, or are there some drawbacks to it?
It depends a lot on what systems you're running on. Like maybe your system doesn't have all the memory in the world, so trying to preload them doesn't necessarily work. If you're not loading all that much stuff and you can do it, it's generally better to have it all preloaded rather than try to load it on the fly. But it's going to depend on how big your world is and how in depth everything is, as well as what system you're running on. Right.
All right. And again, I'm sure if you're free in the future, Tim, if we want to do like another episode of this, I'll be more than happy to have you back on.
Absolutely. Sounds
Yeah.
great to me.
Yeah. This was a lot of fun. Again, as someone who doesn't think about programming, I think more about design. This has been really illuminating. And again, I think it is that challenge, as you said with your Twitch stream or your channel, you talk about all aspects of game dev. And a lot of the stuff, again, it all finds a way to be connected. And it's why it is such a challenge to make a game. I love your point about that sometimes good is better than that perfect that can never come. Because we have seen plenty of developers chase that perfection. And
Yep.
again, like we see games go from, oh, it'll be done in a year, to 3 years, to 7 years, to I just played a game that was 15 years in the making. So it can really spiral, and it's why it's such a challenge, as you were saying earlier, about taking that step from being an enthusiast to treating your game as a product, as something that you intend to produce, develop, and release and market.
It's a whole bunch of decisions on providing value to your audience while also balancing that with the cost of your own development and effort. And it is certainly a tricky one to get. Um, but yeah, good luck.
All right. So, before I let you go, Tim, do you have any social media you would like to plug? Anything like that?
Just basically my Twitch is twitch.tv/Tim Beaudet. I stream the development of racing games as a business. to inspire and motivate other developers to chase their dreams while knowing the risks involved. So I basically share all the ins, the outs, the good, the bad, everything about my own business is shared as much as I can possibly do. There are very few things that have to be secret due to NDAs or respect for other contractors that I work with from time to time. But yeah, join the stream and ask any questions at any point. I'm available to answer them.
All right. And before I do my little end of stream speech, do you have anything you'd like to say to any of your fans watching? Any final points on game programming? Just anything for us to end the stream with a nice little ribbon on it.
Well, thanks for watching. And really, if getting started into game development is something you're interested in and you're not sure where, don't spend forever trying to find the perfect place to start. Just get started and try breaking your problems down to the smallest levels. It's going to be hard. It's going to be a struggle. In fact, everyone that's making games have gone through that struggle. So just stick with it if it's something that interests you, and you can get there.
All right, sounds good. So, with that said, we're going to wrap things up for our chat. Again, Tim, thank you so much for coming on. And like I said, if you are free in the future, we can certainly keep these conversations going.
Awesome. That sounds great.
So, for everyone watching this, live or recorded, thank you so much for tuning in. If you are new, do the liking, subscribing, and commenting. You can check out my Discord and Patreon link down below, and those lovely design books that I mentioned if you want to know more about the gameplay and design of popular genres. Be sure to check out Tim's Twitch and all that. That will be linked in the recorded version. If you are a developer working on an upcoming game or just want to talk shop with me about game dev, please reach out. I am always looking for guests. So, with that said, everyone, have a great rest of your evening. Come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Till next time, take care.